Right, so let's look at parameterized pipelines. So parameterized pipelines allow us to deal with more complex behaviors, such as, oftentimes you won't just have one machine, right? You might have multiple machines, and you might have multiple pipelines that follow the identical algorithm of checking out and compiling and running the tests and deployment. Follow the same identical algorithm of deployment, of packaging and delivery, but are applicable to different projects or to different environments, right? And so we would like to be able to reuse those packaging and deployment and integration algorithms, but be able to configure them for specific environments, right? So parameterized pipelines allow you to to target different environments, and also allows you to, for instance, as you're testing, perhaps you want to use different tests, right? Different set of, maybe a different database, maybe a different network, maybe a different queue, maybe a different dependencies that are specific to different environments, right? Like for instance, QA will probably be tested against a QA database, and probably staging will be tested against a staging database, and production against a production database. Make sense? Right, so we need to be able to configure or parameterize these steps, targeting different environments. So to do that, the Jenkins allows us to create placeholders in our scripts that can be configured either by giving them names, right? Name the placeholders, and give them some default values, and also be configurable from the user interface, right? So that we can actually provide what the values are for different environments. Right? So for instance, if we copy this and create here another pipeline, we can create a normal pipeline. This is a parameterized, and this is CS4500 pipeline. And we paste that. So what this will do is that it'll try to echo this, but with a placeholder. And the placeholder, by default, notice params here is the greeting that has a default value of hello. So at the beginning, you'll say just hello world, all right? But what the pipeline is going to do, Jenkins is going to parse this. Once it runs it, it says, oh, it realized that this was a parameterized value that it could ask us, right? It can greet us. It can provide an input field for us to type in the actual parameter for this particular environment. So let's do that. If we run it, build now. The first time around, it will use the default value, the default value of hello. It'll use this hello world. So this hello is that first value of that parameterized. Now, notice that it still says build now, but if it refresh, notice that it will have realized that this was a parameterized, right? This was a parameterized pipeline. It wasn't just any pipeline. So when I run it with a build with parameters, notice that it realized that there were parameters in the build, and that it can ask us to do something, right? So instead of a hello, we can say goodbye. It says build, and then we can see the output of the second of this second build, and then we can say that goodbye world. No, actually that's very dark. I should use something else. Sorry. So yeah, but you can parameterize it and give it values that you would need for different environments. Yeah, Jenkins rocks. Yeah, that's what I meant. So multi-step pipelines. You could be a little more granular. So this gives you a lot of options. How granular you want to be. That you can break it up into multiple steps, either as a single line. SH allows you to say that this is a shell command, that you can either just be a single line, or it can be multiple lines. You can break it up by using the triple quote, and then break it up into multiple lines. So in this case, notice that these are commands that you can peruse through the remote environment, right? For instance, you can do new item. This is a multi-line. Says 4100. Just pipeline. You could type that in there. Maybe let's say we can add a couple other things. Maybe Java version, right? So let's grab Java version 2. So let's see, so we can see what the remote version of the Java of the JDK that is in the remote machine. We can maybe look at the Maven version. So maybe we can grab that too, copy it in there. We can look at the remote list of files in the remote machine. So let's save that. And we can do the build now. Right, we can look at the logs and the multi-line. For instance, we can see that Java version we have 1.8, right? That we have a Maven 339, right? This is the remote content of the remote directory. Right? So we have full control, right, of the remote operating system through these scripts, right? And then we can run them as we need to. If this were a Java application that we have sent over, we could do a Maven clean install, like we would do normally if we were at the remote machine. Right? So if it works locally on your machine, it should also work remotely on the remote machine. Obviously, with the constraints, whatever constraints the remote machine might have, the particular Maven version, the particular Java version that that normally it would be a version that the entire organization has agreed upon, right? That the various teams have agreed upon, so that they can share the build environment going forward. Console output. Multiple stages. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this Jenkins allows you to define whatever level of granularity do you really want, right? In this case, stages can be used to be the largest groups of steps, right? That might contain some logical step in the process of going from content management to deployment. So, for instance, you might common stage names might be that this is part of the build. Then there's a test stage, there's a packaging stage, and there's a deployment stage. You want to make sure that the previous stage completes before going on to the next one. And usually you would have some logic at each stage that verifies whether that stage was successful or not. And if it was not successful, we would abort, right? And we would abort the build and not continue on to the next stage. So here we just have two simple examples of doing the first build and the second build, and as we run it, the only thing that might be interesting here, let's grab this. The only thing interesting here might be that just each build would have its own console output, its own logical representation here in the pipeline. So I'm not gonna do that. Next, now it might be that that executing these files and these commands might be fairly complex, right? These operating system commands might be, I need to have to do a lot of things. Maybe I have to zip something up. Maybe I have to unzip it. I have to tar it. I have to do all sorts of things, right? And do some calculations at the command line. And really, this IDE that the user interface gives us might be somewhat restrictive. So instead, what we might try to do instead is to capture a lot of that logic already in some bash file or some script, right? That does a lot of the massaging of the operating system for us. That checks to see that we have the correct database version, the correct Java version, the correct Maven version. Make sure that we have all the network accessibility. Verify all sorts of things through our own scripts, and then we can have our our Jenkins file, just point to them, right, and delegate all this work to these other bash files. So here we have a toy example of some shell script that calculates the Fibonacci sequence, right? Just again, it's just an academic toy example. So some script, so that might do something very important, like calculating the Fibonacci numbers. But then the point here is that your pipelines can then reference, right, these shell scripts and run them, right, as if they were at the command line, right? So we were calling Fibonacci of 5 and Fibonacci of 32, and notice that we're also wrapping it inside a timeout, meaning we're giving the this command, a maximum number of time, right? That if the shell script that we're running, right, takes longer than whatever, in this particular case 1 minute, then we're going to fail. Right? We're going to say that we're going to assume that this failed. Right? We might know that this should not take more than 5 seconds. Right? So that if it takes more than some threshold, we can be sure that it failed. Right? So for this to work, you need to be able to have access to the remote machine, which will typically be unrealistic. Usually these machines will be managed by some operations folks, some folks that that are part of the same organization but are not in the same team. Right? Probably this is some other team that manages all the machines for the organization, and usually there will be some communication where you might ask that person to install these scripts remotely in some folder for you, right? And they will put it. Usually, you'll attach it to some job, and they will install the script for you, providing the correct the correct permissions that can be executed, and that Jenkins can execute these scripts. Okay. So usually is through some communication with some other organization, with some other team.